Welcome to this episode of The World According to Irina Tsukerman, our very special series on global politics on the KAJ Masterclass Live. Irina Tsukerman is a US based national security and human rights lawyer as well as a renowned geopolitical analyst. Her writings and commentary have appeared in diverse US and international media and have been translated to over a dozen languages. Every fortnight in the world, according to Irina Tsukerman, we traverse the geopolitical landscape and delve into pressing international issues and gain insight from Irina's expert perspective. Welcome to the show once again, Irina.
Glad to be here as always.
Wonderful. So again, big topic of the day. Let's talk about the Iran US war itself, Hormuz itself. Though Mr. Trump had been in China, a lot of things happening, but the world is still wanting to understand what's happening in that part of the world, and in terms of Hormuz, especially. So, what's the latest update since we last talked about this 2 weeks back, Irina?
Well, since then, there's been a lot of mutual threats and recriminations and tough language and uh, preparations for return back to hostilities. But supposedly, at the last minute before launching strikes, Trump claims that several Gulf states prevented him from moving forward. He said that they were busy negotiating, they were ready with a proposal, and indeed, a proposal was followed. The Trump team was publicly claimed that they're dissatisfied with it, but privately, it seems that they're negotiating quite intensely, supposedly exchanging detailed points for the first time regarding the nuclear issue. What that actually means, nobody really knows. I personally doubt that the US will be able to remove all the enriched uranium from Iran, much less guaranteed that all the nuclear sites will be fully shut down. It seems to me that some sort of symbolic freeze is being negotiated, and Trump is looking for an exit from this effort, but in such a way that he doesn't look like he's losing face, in a way that he can claim to have made a better deal than Obama. What is publicly known about the terms so far do seem remarkably similar to JCPOA, but not much is actually has actually been revealed to the public. A lot of it is rumors, hearsay, leaks, and speculations. What we know is that after pulling back from his preparations for attack, Trump did have a long call with Prime Minister Netanyahu. It appears to be a heated conversation, after which Trump claimed publicly that Israel will do whatever he says. What that actually means, nobody knows. And so far, we remain in limbo, and so far, not much has changed. The US assets are still in the Strait of Hormuz. The blockade is still imposed by both sides. The many countries around the world are still losing money or looking for alternative routes, pipelines, and so forth. And of course, the US is also trying to get other countries to lean on Iran and pressure them into making greater concessions, especially concerning the Strait of Hormuz. But there hasn't been any major changes either in the status of that body of water or in the status of the standoff. No resolution has been announced so far.
Absolutely, absolutely. So who is winning in this? Who is better negotiator here? Is Iran a better negotiator here, or is Trump? Trump continue to be a good deal maker still?
Every day that US is not attacking Iran is a victory for Iran, and every concession that US makes, however small, is still a win in Iran's book, because it's one less thing that they have to consider giving up. And in the weeks and months since the beginning of the airstrikes, they have been exacerbating internal repression. They've been executing prisoners. So, for all the Trump's original claims about assisting the protesters, in fact, brutal repression has followed, and no one has been helped as a result of that, with the exception of a small group of women who may have been a distraction, a diversion by Iran to achieve some sort of a propaganda victory for both sides and to keep the talks going. Uh, Another issue is not only the issue of negotiations or the outcomes from those talks. For Iran, the idea of weakening U.S. and its allies is also a victory. Economic costs that it's imposing on the U.S. are uh, just as important to the regime as the any positive outcome economically or militarily for its own concerns. And putting pressure on other countries, be they India, Japan, South Korea, or Europe, are also a win in Iran's book, because that leads to weakening of rivals. It leads to tensions with the United States. It leads to a situation where liberal democracies are seen as having less advantage than previously in terms of the economic strength, overall political cohesion, or ability to resolve complex problems. The worse economically and otherwise the toll on the world, the happier the regime. It actually strengthens them from into their vision in the region. The worse off everyone else's, the less bad they appear, and the alternative, the bridging the divide between their own disastrous economy and the alternatives that are visible elsewhere, and they can position their adversaries as incompetent, weak, and incapable of achieving a major victory, and that can be used very effectively to galvanize supporters all over the world, which they're doing. Just take a look at the political landscape in the United States, in the United Kingdom, in the UK. Iran linked terrorists have attacked a number of targets also inside the European Union. In the US, politicians sharing pro Hamas, anti Semitic, anti Israel messaging are winning primaries, or at least making a name for themselves, or going out with a bang and causing divisions inside both Democrat and Republican parties. So Iran's strategy is actually working. Ironically, they're making more impact abroad than they're making in the region. They're not militarily strong enough to achieve any serious breakthrough against the US, but they are able to weaken the cohesion internally in many places.
Absolutely, Irina. So, one question comes to my mind, Irina, is that does this war, conflict, does this need leave world a more safer place or a much more dangerous place after this escalation, which nobody is able to solve? Because Iran will become much more, and it's a regime in a different sort, a government of a different sort who is looking at more of survival. They're looking at nuclear ambitions is totally different than a lot of other countries perhaps who have organically developed their nuclear power. Do you think it is going to happen soon, and that nobody will be able to stop them, and then Middle East will become a bit more different terrain? All the other countries will have a different, we had already a different experience this time with US not being able to do anything, and later on even the US will not be able to so-called threaten the way it has been, especially Mr. Trump talking about wiping out civilization and all that.
Well, here's the thing. I wouldn't say that Iran has gotten stronger as a result of this confrontation. On the contrary, it clearly lost a lot of military assets, a lot of leadership. There's been some level of destabilization. But I would say that the rest of the world, including the US, have gotten weaker as a result. No one is winning. I wouldn't say that there is a clear victory except a propaganda victory. Um, Iran's goal is not to improve its own position, but to weaken everybody else's. It's too weak to become to suddenly independently improve its situation. It doesn't have the capacity to rebuild independently. It will need a lot of assistance from external, from Russia, China, North Korea, and etc. And anyone willing to work with it, which is not so many people right now. But the fact of its ability to weaken other countries, to weaken alliances and cohesion, these are all the social and political fragmentation we're witnessing in the West, having yet another pressure point and another flashpoint in the face of this conflict, is putting a lot of strain from the economies that have been roiling since COVID, and followed by the war in Ukraine. And in Africa there's Sudan and other conflicts, and now waves of jihadists, and in various other places there are also associated tensions and pressure points. So all of that is adding to the strain. It's draining resources. It's creating additional distractions and diversions. The more conflicts break out, the less the international community can focus on resolving any one particular problem, or to allocate resources, humanitarian, military, political, diplomatic, or economic, towards any particular situation. So everybody is getting worse off. Iran is not necessarily rising as a result, but it's dragging everybody else down. This is what we are seeing. Now, in terms of nuclear program, there's no way to predict what Iran actually has in mind and how soon and how quickly they're willing or able to finish that project, or whether they're really counting on buying a nuke from Pakistan, for instance, or from assorted rogue actors, or working with North Korea to purchase their capabilities. Who knows? The point is, so long as that threat lingers over the world's heads, it's never going to be something that people cannot keep in mind. That means, of course, the prospects of a nuclear race in the Middle East are entirely possible, and that means that there is an increased chance of instability, of a conflict accidentally escalating, or of a rogue actor getting their hands on nuclear material or other dangerous materials that could be used for dirty bombs or for who knows what. So we are seeing a lot of chaos. Not necessarily other major conflicts, but minor conflicts proliferating and minor issues. Increasing uncertainty. Uncertainty means investment risks. Uncertainty means that while some big players may be making tons of money on Wall Street and on stock markets around the world, for average people, this means higher cost in living. It means inflation. It means supply chain disruptions. It means harder access to what they need. It means falling currency. It means having to prioritize and ration certain assets. It means that life becomes harder, more difficult, and there's and it snowballs over time. This means that if you have crisis after crisis, the chance of it being cleanly resolved and having no residual effect diminishes over time. It means you accelerate the wear and tear of the economy until you can no longer keep up with the standard of life, with the difficulties being imposed, and your life starts getting worse, and it will take more and more time to recover and to get back to the place where we were, much less start improving and moving in the direction of improved conditions for more people. We are going to see a very hard decade in front of us, where more people will struggle that didn't have to struggle before.
Absolutely, absolutely. What about Iran's relationship? Because Middle East, you already see what happened in the last 2 months. Even outside diplomatically, after all these problems, stopping of ships, firing at ships, looking at all the problems already the world is facing, especially in my part of the world, how do you think Iran will be able to maintain even a semblance of good relationships going forward? What would be its talking points at all? Will it be a difficult time for it, and the whole thing will build up a lot of economic pressure back back home after whatever way the things settle bit?
Well, Iran is counting on a combination of factors. One, repressive tactics internally. Two, friendly actors in some of the other countries in the region. The Houthis are still fairly strong in Yemen. They have been keeping relatively quiet, but they've also been accumulating weapons during all this time. In Iraq, a relatively friendly prime minister is in charge. He's a banker for pro Iran political factions. In Lebanon, there is an effort to put down Hezbollah, but quite frankly, it's not likely to be resolved anytime soon and not easily. There are all sorts of military complications, there are political complications. It's another morass. Um, Even in Gaza, where the US is trying to impose some sort of a peace, Hamas has entrenched itself enough that after a while they may be able to uh, try to return to power, to more power, because Israel cannot control parts of Gaza indefinitely. It's too costly. Now they're having a government crisis. The government is about to be dissolved. Uh, so there may not be funding to maintain long-term operations, whether in Lebanon or in Gaza. So Iran has its assets in the region, and it's looking to take advantage of them. Moreover, Iran has been engaged in active trade with several of the GCC states, which means that completely terminating economic relations is not going to be that easy. It's going to restructuring the economy, trying to find alternative investments in the current uncertain climate, even for a country like UAE, which is very dynamic, very economically active and successful, is going to be hard. UAE is trying to move forward with new relationships in Central Asia with India and so forth, but simply put, Iran has been a major factor in its economy, and simply divesting and closing everything down overnight is not going to happen. So Iran is counting on these countries being forced into some sort of economic exchange, even on very cold political terms. It doesn't really care about cultural exchanges and things like that. And quite frankly, it has improved its relations with Saudi Arabia on a political level quite a bit. Saudi Arabia is increasingly concerned about these attacks, and they have been going while there's been tough language in terms of a pushback against Iran in any way. We have not seen much. So at least some of the GCC countries will try to accommodate Iran and some at least maintain a semblance of normalcy in order to avoid escalation. All of that is in Iran's favor, and the fact that the European Union has not terminated economic or political relations as a result of this crisis is also Iran sees as a potential to maintain the status quo, at least, and at best perhaps in the future sort of return to some level of acceptance internationally, especially if exasperation with the Trump administration and the US direction continues to go and is not resolved in any way.
Absolutely, absolutely. I noticed you didn't name China. You did not talk about the
Mhm.
relationship with Russia. Any particular reason? And did this talk? We'll come to the Trump China visit separately. But what
Mhm.
did Iran figure at all in U.S. China talks down there in Trump's visit? How is that dynamic working? We thought Iran has a very good relationship with China as well as with Russia.
Nothing has changed. The reason I didn't mention these two countries is because nothing has changed. Neither country is going to drop what they're doing with Iran just because US asked them to. Nor do they see it to their advantage to do that. After all, what can they substitute with that? For China, Iran is one of its top oil um, oil traders. Um, China has significant rentier relationships in oil and gas rich territories there. China has invested a lot into propping Iran up. And you have a sunken cost fallacy, you know. And the more sanctions US imposes on different entities, the harder it is to track and follow them up. So China is taking its chances. They also know that US can simply block its relations with China over Iran, so trade will continue. Some specific officials or entities might get sanctioned once in a while, but at the end of the day, uh, China has a lot more to gain from maintaining its relations with Iran, even from sending illicit materials and illicit equipment, dual use equipment, or even weapons there. Similar to Russia, Russia is too entrenched in its regional strategy to give up one of the few allies it has, even if there is a great deal of distrust, differences, tensions, and so forth on some level. It doesn't have many options otherwise. It is heavily sanctions. Iran, China, some other countries, and some of the avenues which have built financial mechanisms for circumventing Western sanctions and maintaining some sort of a financial economic stability. So for Russia to turn away from Iran, there is no advantage to it. It would crash its economy, which had maintained stability specifically because of these mechanisms it was able to build. It's not going to get it any benefits in the West because it has simultaneously has no intentions of putting an end to its war in Ukraine. It needs Iran for its assorted military adventures. There's no benefit in giving all of that up, none whatsoever. At some point, countries have entrenched their ideology, their political vision so completely that there is no stepping back until their entire structure changes and the entire methods of operations changes. I don't see it happening under the current circumstances. And this is also why Trump's talks with China about Iran went nowhere, basically speaking. Everyone's tried to play it off like there's been some concessions. In reality, nothing major came out of it, nor could anyone seriously hope that there would. What does China gain from helping US with that? Quite frankly, this whole situation helps China. China received a concession for its own ships. The only obstacle, Iran is not an obstacle to it. US is. So the more pressure Iran puts on the US, the faster US gets out of there as far as China is concerned, and then China can go back to business as usual. And the very reason China was helping Iran in the first place is to put pressure on the United States, of course. So if US is distracted with yet another crisis, even if there's some cost to China, first of all, some of it can be circumvented. Second, US can't maintain a blockade forever. And third, it leaves more openings for China's own interests in South China Sea. So the more crisis as far as China is concerned, the better. And for Russia, it's also the same calculus.
Absolutely, absolutely. So, is it that Pakistan is Iran's new best friend in today's time? After Pakistan being best friend with Trump, how does this look like? How is Pakistan being able to do that, maintaining still relationship with Saudi Arabia, that deal, NATO type deal with Saudi Arabia, sending its planes, to defend against Iranian missiles and drones? And the hope that Iran will now play a bigger role in Central and Southeast Asia thanks to links to Pak diplomacy. Is Mr. Trump behind this? Telling Pakistan that help me solve this issue so that I can win my midterms. You can give them silently. You can give them the nuke technology. Everyone will be happy. By that time, I will be able to complete my turn peacefully.
Here's the thing. The real conflict of interest is not for Pakistan, which is doing exactly what it's always been doing for many decades. It's actually reverted to its original role. The conflict of interest here is for Saudi Arabia, which is essentially helping the very country that is benefiting from the attacks it launched on Saudi Arabia. I'll explain why. Pakistan has always balanced between Iran and Saudi Arabia. Its political factions have also had divided loyalties for since its creation as an independent state. None of that is new except for people who couldn't be bothered to look past the last several years. For everyone else who's even had a cursory understanding of the general area, none of that should come as a surprise. So what we're seeing now is simply Pakistan's restoration of doing that very balancing act. Why is no one cutting off Pakistan? Because it's both sides need it. Iran needs it for smuggling operations, for ports, that it needs to operate, for making arrangements, and for some of the factions also to help fight against the Baluchis and so forth. Why does Saudi Arabia need it? Because a significant number of the Saudi military is comprised of Pakistani soldiers, and they now have an official defense pact. And Saudi in Pakistani sent nuclear powered. Nuclear capable jet planes to Saudi Arabia, in addition to other military equipment. So, on the one hand, the Pakistanis are sort of a guarantors in case the situation does escalate beyond the manageable. But on the other hand, it's not like Saudi Arabia has much of a choice. They do not have the independent capacity to confront Iran, and they don't have the desire to do that, even if they did have the capacity. They're not fully engaged with all the equipment they purchased from the United States. As for Pakistanis, they have the best of the both worlds. They know that Saudis are never going to dump them because they're too dependent on them on a very practical level. And they also know that Iran is not going anywhere because of the benefits of geography. Um, so this is the situation that they're facing. They're kind of milking two cows without actually having to do all that much. After all, Iran is not really planning to start a full-out war with Saudi Arabia, at least not yet. So those jet planes, those soldiers, they're not going to be used, and Saudi Arabia is not going to call on Pakistan to confront Iran. So long as they think they can manage the situation and intercept a few drones and missiles here and there. So for now, the Pakistanis can have whatever they want without having to do all that much other than talk. And talking for them has been beneficial. And this is also the same thing, interestingly, with the US. US too. The Trump administration is in a conundrum. It can't force Saudi Arabia to fight Iran. There is no way to do that. There's not enough leverage in the world that US has to make that happen. It can't force Iran to stop doing what Iran is doing. As we have seen, what US has tried so far has failed. So the only thing it can do is try to manage some sort of a situation between limited military action and talks. And it has a limited number of go-betweens. You have, who are willing to talk to everybody. Qatar, Oman, Pakistan, all three countries are deeply conflicted, all have strong ties to Iran. None of them is fully trustworthy. So, US has tried with Oman for a while, then it's tried with Qatar, now it's trying with Pakistan. And it's going to be exchanging these players depending on what it's getting from them at any particular moment. But none of that is really going to work. Why? Because no one is interested in making it work. Not the intermediaries, certainly not Iran itself.
Absolutely, absolutely. It looks like Pakistan is the country to watch out for in the future. It is a peacemaker. It is also a deal maker, and with lots of economic advantages may happen with with oil from Mr. Trump. He will find it in Pakistan itself, and a lot of oil from maybe Iran in the coming future. Good times for Pakistan in the coming from all aspect diplomatically, in terms of a chance for a Nobel Peace Prize, as well as, economically, obviously, with oil flowing in from all directions.
I do find it an ironic possibility that Pakistan could get a Nobel Peace Prize, not because it resolved anything, but because it played that role so flamboyantly and so successfully, and everyone else is at its wits' end as to what to do, and Trump cannot move backwards or forwards in this situation. He's stuck with this decision. So Pakistan has become the only way out of trying to sort of negotiate your way out of this conundrum.
Absolutely, absolutely, Irina. From that part of the world, let's move on to my part of the world, that is Prime Minister Modi's visit to, UAE, five-nation tour, starting with the UAE, ending with Rome. Help us understand what this is all about. How do you see it from that part of the world? Why starting with UAE? What happened there, and what happened in the other nation tour?
Well, it's important to note that for UAE is not simply a commercial trip to do some business, although I'm sure plenty of that was done as well. We are seeing a geopolitical realignment, and we are seeing the fact that India has to respond to these crises next door that are significantly impacting its own economy in many ways. Its own ships cannot get through easily without being attacked. There's a economic hardships that are directly resulting from this particular situation. And on top of everything else, Saudi Arabia's move away from the sort of Abrahamic sphere and into the Turkish Pakistani terrain is endangering economic corridors that were being negotiated with India. And I'm leaving aside Israel because there were also separate bilateral and other multilateral corridors and deals that were being discussed that are fraught with potential obstacles now. So India is seeking to work with the more closely, and not simply because of potential for economic exchanges, but also because of this need to find alternative pathways for economy, both in the Middle East, in the Red Sea, and other strategically important regions. There are efforts to work on modifying parts of IMEC with Israel as well, perhaps finding pathways into the Eastern Mediterranean and expanding business there. It's very obvious that constraining itself by the previous geographic and logistical operations is proving to be disastrous. There's no way that the current situation can be sustained without adjustments. And the visit was quite expensive. It covered a lot of issues that are both generally have been on everyone's radar and more specifically have been affected by the current crisis: energy security, defense cooperation, maritime security, cyber defense, secure communications, strategic petroleum reserves, LPG supply, shipping, infrastructure, AI, supercomputing, investments, and skill developments. All of these things are tied together, affect one another, and many of them have been the need to address many of them has accelerated as a result of these developments. It was a lot of ground to cover during a relatively short visit. It was not about ceremonies this time or photo ops, but about India's need to secure its western flank, to stabilize energy inflows, to deepen Gulf partnerships, and to reduce vulnerability to disruption in the Strait of Hormuz, Red Sea, Arabian Sea, and wider Indian Oceans. Since the Houthi disruptions started a few years ago, India has been dragged deeper and deeper into the naval maritime terrain, has had to expand its naval capacity a great deal. It has been forced to project power a lot more, and now it also needs to look at partnering and working with other countries and integrating its own capacities into a more structured network. Originally, US and the Quad were supposed to be that model, but we hear very little of those discussions since that initial visit between Modi and Trump early in Trump's second term. Most of the issues that were and agreements that we discussed at the time have been set aside or not followed up upon very aggressively. So the new Indo-Pacific strategy for India now looks towards other partners. And the defense component was quite important to that particular discussion. there is a going. India and UAE are working on a strategic defense partnership framework, which covers industrial cooperation, advanced technologies, innovation, joint training, maritime security, and cyber defense. The secure communications I previously mentioned, and also information exchange. So it's a very comprehensive partnership. This is not one-off agreements, and it means that the relationship between the two countries is moving beyond arms sales, diaspora diplomacy, and energy trade. It's now entering the realm of military interoperability, defense production, intelligence adjacent coordination, and even shared maritime domain awareness. A lot of depth to that. And of course, the maritime security element is particularly important out of that because India is quite dependent on the Gulf for energy imports, especially now for remittances, for trade routes, and also for commercial access to West Asia, Africa, and Europe. And UAE is very near critical areas. It has a major port, it has logistics and shipping footprint all across the region. So, by strengthening cooperation in those areas, India is positioning itself to play a larger role in protecting sea lanes, monitoring illicit finance, and smuggling networks, tracking drone and missile threats, and responding to any disruptions that could affect its own energy flows. It looks to be playing a much more active role in joint defense and not simply be a beneficiary of other countries. And the energy agreements are right up there also because India and EU are advancing cooperation around reserves of oil, um, arrangements involving the ADNOC, it's a major energy giant, and of course, the Indian reserve infrastructure is. The idea is to allow India to hold more crude in storage, to secure long-term access to supply, and to improve resilience during oil shocks, such as what is happening right now. India has been trying to expand its reserve capacity because its economy is highly vulnerable to imported crude related shortages. So, participation of UAE gives it both the supply assurance and a trusted Gulf partner with the capacity to both store, invest, and even deliver. There is another practical outcome to all of this because LPG is politically sensitive inside India right now. It affects households, it affects inflation, it affects subsidy burdens, and even domestic stability. So, securing long term LPG supply from UAE strengthens its energy backing and reduces exposure to spot market volatility. And amidst the current situation, we are hearing about a dollar and rupee swap. This is particularly important. So, what to make of the other countries? Why Italy? Actually, the East Mediterranean aspect of it and the economic exchanges with the European Union, such as the free trade agreement we saw earlier, they are both quite rudimentary in India's calculus right now because Italy is one of the key players in the East Med right now. It has not been a particularly active defense partner, but that could change depending on incentives. And in terms of trade agreements, India and Italy see a lot of opportunities for securing and expanding these relationships. And frankly, a lot of it is out of necessity. Both countries are turning to new partnerships as a result of the economic crunch and the crunch on economic corridors and routes resulting from the current situations.
Absolutely, absolutely, Irina. The excitement in the India UAE relationship is understandable with so much of details that you gave. What was the so much of excitement in Netherlands, Sweden, Norway, and Italy? They also were very excited. The governments honored a bit more. In a normal trip, looked like they were waiting for our prime minister's visit.
Yes, well, the Netherlands are important because of technology and industrial competition aspect, and quite frankly, it's a message to China. Semiconductors, tech sovereignty, and entry into Europe's industrial core are at the heart of that visit. So besides those components, the discussions included renewable energy, water systems, innovation, trade expansion, and defense cooperation. So India also tied the visit to opportunities created by the broader India-EU trade environment and the free trade agreement that I mentioned earlier. This is a lot more than just another bilateral trade agreement. The truth is, Netherlands is playing an increasing role inside Europe's industrial ecosystem because the semiconductor supply chains are now central to any technological calculus, whether it's renewable green technologies, whether it's defense tech, whether it's computing advancements. Without advanced semiconductors, there is no real progress to be made. But there's also other things like precision manufacturing, logistics, agricultural technology, clean energy, and advanced infrastructure. India wants three things out of this. First, manufacturing relocation. Second, technology access. And third, participation in supply chains that reduce dependence on China. Yes, despite being a member of BRICS and despite being one of the countries actively involved in advanced technology exchanges with China, India is seeking more independence from that. So the reason for that is India increasingly sees itself as not merely a labor market, but also as a future industrial and technological platform. The other issue is that having a relationship with the Dutch gives India influence inside the continental Europe without relying entirely on the larger political economy. So it's seeking to diversify its political ties as well.
Absolutely, absolutely. Now, from here, let's go to President Trump's China visit. It was, how would you like to call it? What did anything happen? And Mr. Trump, who is supposed to, be very speaking about in great terms about tariffs, about everything, about doing this, about that, about wiping out civilizations. In my personal understanding, he was very quiet this time, and China was speaking more. Is my assessment or correct? And do
Yes.
correct me if I'm incorrect. Help us understand then, was there a visit at all from that sense of view of achieving anything at all? There was so much of money spent on this visit.
Well, frankly, I don't think Trump was really counting on China to resolve the political problems for the reasons I stated before. China is too conflicted, and even Trump has to understand it. I think he wanted to show a good faith effort in engaging China rather than fighting on a public stage. But I think the big reason for the visit was trying to secure business. That, however, did not go as planned. However, before I get into all of these details, it's important to note that the visit was a disaster before it was even started, and not many people really connected those two things or paid much attention. But you have to look at it from China's perspective. What happened? What happened is that Secretary of State Rubio, who has been sanctioned by China since 2020, was an integral part of the trip for obvious reasons. And in order to allow him in, China had to change the spelling of his name. However, it's important to note what it changed it to. It changed it to the words that basically meant stupid, and this was quite humiliating for the American side. And the fact that Trump put up with it and that Rubio himself agreed to these conditions showed, in from China's perspective, that US needed China enough that they were willing to swallow this humiliation. However, if you understand Chinese culture, losing face like that in public is a major disaster, and China itself would never have allowed themselves to do that if the positions were reversed. I guarantee you that the visit would simply not have happened had US made similar conditions for Chinese officials. So the fact is, China, from the very setup of this visit, from the very conditions in the post, felt itself in a position of superiority and behaved accordingly. And so, from the first moment, it was in a very assertive position. And once you start with this kind of strategic communication, this sort of signaling, it positions you a certain way, and similarly, the other side is almost forced into a position of defensiveness. But it was more than that. Of course, there were the optics of power, the very banquet, the optics around all the shows that China put on was about power. The very aggressive position on Taiwan at at the risk of alienating and putting their guests into an politically awkward position in public, that was very much a test of their power, and it worked because while Trump claimed that by engaging in strategic ambiguity he was keeping China on its toes, in reality that alone, from China's perspective, was interpreted as weakness. The fact that US was not able to firmly push back on these demands right away and say that basically who US sells weapons to is none of China's concern, and that US has a strong relationship with Taiwan and so forth. Uh, this has signaled to China that they have room to continue pushing, and they will continue push until somebody finally says no. Just to see how far they can go. And now we now have a painful choice to see whether Trump will move forward with a weapons sale package, and meanwhile, I, a senior defense official's visit to China is at risk because now China, having felt that there is room to give, from US perspectives, they're now making demands conditioning that visit on the US blocking the arms sales to Taiwan. Of course, Taiwan responded with all sorts of statements, but the reality is Taiwan is extremely dependent on the US. US is very dependent on Taiwan for the time being for the AI production as well, but in terms of pure leverage, there is no comparison for obvious reasons. So we are in a situation where China feels like it has enough leverage to bully and push US around, and that was visible to everybody, and everyone who tried to play it down to say that it was a non-happening event, they were looking only at the substance of the terms. The reason nothing was happening is because China didn't want it to happen. In fact, it also humiliated Trump in many other ways. For instance, they had negotiated a return to a beef trade deal, and almost immediately after reimposing the deal, China removed it back. Then there was a talk of up to 500 Boeing planes that China was supposed to buy. At most, 200 might be bought, if at all. So that was never concluded at the negotiations. As for the private deals that Trump and his associates supposedly secured, it's really not clear what happened there, but none of it necessarily is advantageous to the US. Quite frankly, engaging with the country regularly involved in data targeting, in privacy violation, in industrial espionage and surveillance is probably suboptimal at best. I don't know how much of a victory that would be for the American people, other than some companies making money off of it. And of course, the $1 trillion deal about factory investments, I think that was the last we've heard of it, because I don't recall that even being publicly mentioned, much less anything coming out of it. So the deal, this was not simply a waste of time or an impasse. This was a disastrous visit as far as I see, and I think China is very much evaluating it as such and celebrating it, and celebrating the fact that they were able to go toe to toe to US, that they're being seen as an international actor who's been called upon to lean on Iran, to get involved in all sorts of international situations, and which is needed by the US enough to risk, these humiliating circumstances. So, in my opinion, that was a huge strategic loss. I know many people don't want to admit it for various reasons, but I certainly call a spade as I see it.
Absolutely. Disastrous visit, as you say. And looking at this disastrous visit, and also perhaps the perceived, it came out that US is trying to maintain the strategic ambiguity on Taiwan. And if that is very intentional or understood, do you think it leaves ground to for China to actually look at taking an attempt on Taiwan sooner than one would have hoped or looked at?
Here's the thing. As far as the US concerned, I think this hypocritical positioning of having the one China policy but selling arms to Taiwan simply doesn't work. It doesn't make any sense. Certainly doesn't make any sense today. Maybe at early stages when there were still hopes that China could somehow become more reasonable, whatever. Maybe at that point it made sense. Now it certainly doesn't. Now China is an exceptionally powerful and dangerous actor, and there's no ambiguity about China's positions with regards to Taiwan or anything else. In my opinion, China has made its interest in its global hegemony abundantly clear, and it's foolish to ignore where it's all going. So, U.S. should likewise clarify its position. It should recognize Taiwan's independence, and it should position itself as a very clear protector of the regional order. I don't expect that to come from Trump for the same reasons I didn't expect much in terms of defense of Ukraine. For whatever reason, Trump does not see authoritarian infringement on democracies as anything unusual or as anything untoward. That is going to be a big problem. However, Congress and future U.S. administrations should position themselves accordingly. And in my opinion, the next president, Republican or Democrat, if he doesn't recognize Taiwan, he's going to be risking a major regional confrontation. For now, I think China would prefer to avoid a military engagement if it can at all be helped. Why? Because why waste people and ammunition if you don't have to? If there's some other way of getting what you want, why not use it? It's simply a pragmatic consideration in China's case, and this is why we have seen repeated political tests that the US kept failing, and I mentioned them before. The very public visit by the head of the opposition in Taiwan, the continuing propaganda aimed at Taiwanese citizens, including many of those who are not all that concerned about China's intentions or who believe that reunification would even be, either tolerable or even economically beneficial. We have seen the attempts to block the Taiwanese president from going to Africa, which was initially successful, with no word from the US, by the way. Eventually, thanks to Taiwanese own workarounds, they were able to make that trip happen later. But US has shown itself to not be reliable in that instance. So if US cannot be relied in a small political matter, can it will be relied where serious resources are going to be concerned? That's a very big question. In my opinion, Taiwan should not be relying on the US. It should be looking for other potential regional configurations. So we are seeing a complex scenario where China is sending very clear signals that it is very much on a trajectory to reunify with Taiwan, whether it's going to be through a political coalition of some sort by boosting relevant players, taking advantage of a current political impasse in Taiwan itself, or by some other means. It is looking very much to get there. But if none of these plans ultimately work out, then the military option is still very much on the table. But the general direction, I think, should be very obvious to anyone who is watching. We should not be fooling ourselves about where China wants to be in 3 to 5 years from now.
Absolutely, absolutely. And before I come to the last topic of the day about Ukraine and Russia, one thing that comes to my mind is How do you just step into, Marco Rubio's shoes and think what he must be thinking at this point in time, changing names to something like stupid? And then, there were big words earlier on during Venezuela, during Iran, and also there are talks of he being, a presidential candidate perhaps in the very near future. How would he be thinking at himself? Why did I have to do it? Was it necessary? Was it intentional by somebody else in the administration? you know how would Daddy once be looking at it? Does it make him a much more, self-respecting person and better candidate in the future? How do you think it is happening?
I don't think J.D. Vance necessarily benefits from it. Unless you think that these two individuals are the only Republicans running for office, which I can assure you they're not. I don't think it's much of an advantage to J.D. Vance because he was not there at all. On the one hand, he avoided a ready-made disaster, but on the other hand, he also didn't was not important enough, or for other reasons could not be on the trip. I mean, look, logistically speaking, for the president and the vice president to go on the same trip is of this type is highly unusual anyway. But let's just say he certainly didn't raise his own profile by staying home. On the other hand, he has his own problems that have nothing to do with Rubio or what happens with him. He has suffered a series of humiliating and failed efforts at publicity in the US. He has tried to gain attention by catering to the podcast crowd of young, somewhat radicalized Republican men. I don't think it will give him enough votes to overcome the obstacles he's facing regarding his overall positioning in the primaries. And let's face it, it's not clear whether Trump will ultimately endorse either of them or whether he will choose to endorse no one at all. I think both of them are in serious troubles, and I think in both cases they are not going to make it through the primaries.
Absolutely. We'll watch out for that, Irina. And that is, then we'll watch out for new names. If that, I'm sure a lot of people, planners, would also be listening to it and looking at if no, if they don't have any chance, why put money on them at all? Let's get a brand new horse and see how it all goes. Be that as it may, that's in the future. In terms of Russia, Ukraine. Even Mr. Putin said, there could be peace soon. And suddenly we see more firing, more exchange of fire between these two. Ceasefire is gone. All the other things are happening back to square one. Even Zelensky has said there could be more possible Russian, Belarusian attacks on Kyiv or even NATO states. Are we moving towards that peace that everyone thought will happen very soon? Or is it going to be more bloodshed?
I think it's entirely possible that Russia may look for some sort of a temporary ceasefire, not to put an end to the war, but to regroup and to start to open a new front. More likely at a NATO state, not at Ukraine. Opening a new front at Ukraine will not gain it anything. It will only force it to lose more troops and to separate its own troops into multiple fronts in the same area. It's not advantageous. But attacking a weak NATO state and forcing the NATO countries to scramble to make a decision whether or not to attack Russia and to what extent and what resources to send and to move resources away from Ukraine. Most of these countries are still waiting for all the new weapons, the order to come in, and they'll be waiting for some time, especially now that US has slowed down its delivery, allegedly due to the crisis with Iran. So this would be a good effort. What I mean by ceasefire, I mean not a real truce, but more of a frozen conflict situation where there's a temporary refocus on another front. I don't believe Russia has any intention of really putting down weapons or leaving or anything like that. I don't think they're going anywhere, especially that because in some areas that they've occupied, they're quite successfully trying to replace the population and to engineer demographic resettlement of reality. So there's no reason for them to leave. but they may refocus more of their military efforts elsewhere and temporarily choose not to advance, for instance. That is entirely possible. I don't believe a real truce is going to be possible. I think the reason Russia is redoubling efforts now is, first of all, they're frustrated by Russia's gains recently, both domestically and by more successful targeting of Russia, and also because behind the scenes, U.S. may be putting more pressure on Ukraine to try to make concessions, precisely because Ukraine has been on the offensive very successfully. So. Um, and that could ironically prolong active battlefield because Ukraine has no reason to move back and to freeze the movement if they feel they can make significant gains and retake territory. So that moves Trump further away from the quote unquote peace that he so much desires, from the idea of a Nobel Prize and so forth. But frankly speaking, well, I think Ukraine is trying to force Russia to come back to a negotiating table. I don't think it's very likely. Not in the immediate future. We'll see what coming months bring. Anything can change. New weapons could be used, new techniques can be used, but unless Ukraine suddenly comes up with an overwhelming force enough not only to substitute for some numbers of people, but to actually overwhelm and push back Russian forces, there is no reason for either side to actually move away from battlefield.
Absolutely. Irina, my last question to you then, looking into the future, how do you see one particular thing? There's a lot of talk about, Putin, the way he is behaving, the way, maybe losing grip over power. Who do you think, will what will do you think will happen first? Which will end? The war will end first, or Putin losing his grip over power? That will happen first.
I think a lot depends on Putin. He may take a risk in attacking NATO just to show that he still got it. On the other hand, it's entirely plausible that the entire rumor about him supposedly losing power in the first place has been his own propaganda campaign to lull his enemies into a state of complacency and to get them less focused on helping Ukraine and so forth. It's entirely possible that he feels perfectly safe. Now, Stalin seemed to be at the peak of his power when he was assassinated by a small group of very close and trusted associates. Something like that could happen with Putin, no matter how paranoid he is. If people feel desperate enough, if they feel they've got nothing to lose from removing him, and if they feel that their own lives are in danger from his increasing paranoia, that could potentially happen. But that is not something that is easy to predict or foretell. It could happen and could just easily not happen at all. That is not something anyone should be counting on.
Absolutely, absolutely. There is so much happening in the world, and there is so much that needs to be decoded, and that we do every 2 weeks with you. With this, it's a wrap on this very special edition of The World According to Irina Tsukerman on the KAJ Masterclass Live. Thank you so much indeed for joining us.
Thank you so much.